They called me the houseguest, not behind my back, not in whispers, but right there in the open, in the hallway, in front of neighbors, at the dinner table where I once carved the Thanksgiving turkey. I heard it first from my grandson, Danny. He was just 8. I'd baked him a cinnamon apple tart, the kind he used to beg for. And as I placed the plate in front of him, he asked, without looking up from his iPad, "Grandma, how long are houseguests allowed to stay?" The words hit like a cough I hadn't prepared for. I laughed at first, confused, thinking maybe it was something he'd heard on TV. But then I caught the look my daughter gave her husband across the room. A tiny, half smile. No one corrected the boy. No one said, "Danny, that's your grandmother. She lives here now." That was the moment I realized. They'd given me a new name, and they were all comfortable with it. The irony is, I gave them that house. Not directly, not on paper. But the down payment came from me, from the sale of my childhood home after my husband passed. I told them it was a gift, a way to start their lives, raise a family in comfort, build something solid. I moved into a smaller apartment after that, something closer to town, and I told myself I wouldn't be a burden. I repeated it like a prayer. I will not be a burden. Then came the diagnosis. Nothing sudden, nothing dramatic. Just a slow unraveling of breath, fatigue, confusion, mild congestive heart failure, the doctor said, with that polite finality they use when trying not to scare you. He advised I stay with family, someone to keep an eye. "You're not dying," he said, "but you shouldn't be living alone anymore." I remember the silence in the exam room. I remember how the air felt heavier, like I'd aged a decade in 10 minutes. I didn't want to move in with my daughter, not because I didn't love her, but because I knew her love came with fine print. When I arrived with my suitcase, one suitcase, that's all, the guest room had been prepared. Crisp white sheets, a lamp with no bulb, and a narrow dresser that still held someone else's clothes. Her husband called it Granny's landing pad. My daughter laughed. "We'll get used to each other," she said, and kissed my forehead like I was a rescued stray. For a while, I believed her. I tried to keep out of the way. I cooked when I could. I washed dishes quietly. I went to bed early and didn't complain when the thermostat was set to Arctic. But it didn't take long for the mood to change. They began hosting more dinner parties, wine-fueled evenings with neighbors and colleagues, all of whom assumed I was visiting. No one ever corrected them. I was introduced as my mum - she's staying with us for a bit. Not living, not home, staying. One night, I overheard my daughter say, "It's just until we find a facility that feels right." She wasn't speaking to me. She was on the phone, in her office, door half closed, voice low but not low enough. I sat on the edge of the bed, not mine, but borrowed, and felt something small and final inside me harden. I thought of my own mother then, how I'd bathed her and held her hand when she lost her speech, how I sat with her through the nights when she forgot my name. And here I was, not yet lost, not yet gone, but already being arranged for. I didn't say anything that night. I didn't cry. I made tea the next morning, same as always, and folded the laundry I hadn't dirtied. But I began to notice more things. My medication would disappear, reappear days later. My mail went unopened, tucked into drawers. A financial planner visited one afternoon, and when I asked why, my daughter said it was about optimizing the estate. I wasn't invited to the meeting. Later that week, she asked if I remembered where my will was. "Just in case," she said. "It's better to be prepared." I told her I'd already handled it. She smiled too quickly. "But we could review it, right? Just to be sure." There's something about watching your child, the one you once swaddled, fed, taught to walk, look at you not with concern, but calculation. It's like a second death. And yet, I still wasn't angry. Not fully. I was tired, yes. I was hurt. But part of me wanted to believe she was just overwhelmed. That caregiving had twisted her patience. That maybe, somewhere inside her, the daughter I knew still existed. I gave her one more chance. I left my will, sealed in an envelope, on the kitchen counter one morning. I'd written a note on top. "If you're so curious, here." That night, the envelope was gone. Nothing was said. 2 weeks later, I received a call from the lawyer who had helped draft my estate plan years earlier. A kind man, discreet, meticulous. He told me, gently, that my daughter had called him, asking to make a few adjustments. She'd used my name, claimed I'd authorized her. He didn't proceed, of course, not without hearing from me directly. But he wanted me to know. It may be time, he said carefully, to consider your own next steps. I sat in silence after the call, the receiver resting on my chest like a stone. I was still alive, still lucid, still capable, and yet they were preparing a life that no longer included me. That night, I packed a second suitcase. Not to leave, not yet, but to remind myself that I could, that I wasn't trapped. I slid the bag under the bed and lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the pipes, the occasional burst of laughter from the TV room. I felt invisible, but I also felt something else, something steadier than sadness. I'd spent a lifetime protecting others, giving quietly, expecting little, but I still had one thing they couldn't take from me: choice, and I was about to make one. More than a decade ago, I'd been named executor of my late sister's trust, a role that came with certain privileges: access, documents, discretion. She had no children, and I'd inherited not just her assets but her lawyer. That same man, the one who had called me, now held the revised version of my own will, a version my daughter didn't know existed, a version she would hear read aloud, in full, and in public, sooner than she expected, because a storm was coming, and I'd already chosen the day it would break. I started paying attention differently after that. Every glance, every half-conversation that trailed off when I entered the room, every quiet reshuffling of documents near the kitchen desk. It all meant something now. Not paranoia, not suspicion, just awareness. I kept a small notebook hidden in the lining of my suitcase and wrote things down at night: dates, phrases, the name of the realtor I overheard mentioned over the phone one evening. Off-market, she said. If we price it right, it won't even need staging. She wasn't talking about someone else's house. She was talking about mine. Or at least, the one she thought would be hers. It wasn't just the house. It was my jewelry, too. Family pieces I'd been given by my own mother, stored in a small wooden box I kept in the back of the closet. One afternoon I found it open, the velvet pouch inside loosened, a ring missing. When I asked about it at dinner, my daughter said maybe I'd misplaced it. Her husband chuckled. You sure you didn't wear it and forget where you put it? They were planting seeds, making room for the story they would one day tell, that I was forgetful, that I wasn't well, that I needed help making decisions. I didn't react. I didn't defend. I nodded, swallowed the dry meatloaf, and made a note. That night, I visited the lawyer's office without telling them. I took a cab, wore one of the outfits they'd stopped noticing. I carried with me a folder of documents they thought I'd lost. Deeds, letters, originals. My lawyer, Harold, was waiting. He didn't speak much, just motioned for me to sit and passed over a cup of lukewarm tea. I told him I was ready. We updated the will together. Not changed, just clarified. More precise language, stronger protections. I signed and sealed the envelope myself. When the time comes, I said, you'll know when to read it. He looked at me, not with pity, not with worry, but with the quiet respect of someone who's seen too much. You're not the first, he said, but you might be the calmest. The days that followed were colder, not just in weather, but in spirit. My daughter had started introducing me to people as my mum. She's staying with us for a while we figure things out. I wasn't even the guest anymore. I was now part of a situation, a temporary condition, something being figured out. I smiled through it. Baked bread they didn't eat, tidied rooms I wasn't thanked for. But I noticed they'd begun checking my pill bottles, asking questions about what day it was. They weren't curious. They were gathering, preparing a case. My only mistake, it seemed, was staying healthy longer than they expected. One Sunday morning, I found a stack of brochures left on my bed. Senior living options, one read. Another said, where comfort meets dignity. I laughed out loud, not bitterly, but like someone recognizing the final card being played. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. I folded the papers neatly, placed them on the kitchen counter, and went back to my room. That evening, at dinner, no one mentioned them, but the silence around the table had shape now, like everyone had rehearsed what not to say. Around this time, I made a quiet visit to my old church. I hadn't been in years, not since my husband's memorial, but the priest remembered me. He asked if I was well, and I told him, not everything, but enough. He offered prayer. I asked for something different. I asked if I could use the church hall one afternoon in April, for a small gathering, not a birthday, not a celebration, just a family reflection, I called it. He said of course. I paid in cash. He gave me a gentle look. The kind people give when they don't know how to help, but want you to know they're willing. I chose April because it was after tax season, after the school recital, after spring break, a month where excuses would sound thin. I drafted letters by hand. Not emails, not texts. Letters. One to each family member. My daughter, her husband, my grandson, even the sister-in-law I never liked but who once told me I'd always been the strong one. I mailed them from the downtown post office so they couldn't be traced to our zip code. Each envelope said simply, "I need you to be there." No explanations. Just come. In the days leading up to April, they behaved better, as if the act of receiving something handwritten from me reminded them, briefly, of who I used to be. They made small talk. My daughter helped me trim my nails. Her husband offered to pick up more of my medications. Unsolicited. I didn't take it as kindness. I took it as calculation. They were uncertain, and uncertainty, when handled right, is the best kind of leverage. The morning of the gathering, I dressed with care. Navy blue blouse, the one with pearl buttons. Slacks that still fit. A brooch my husband had given me on our 40th anniversary. My daughter offered to drive. I accepted. In the car, she asked gently, "What is this about, Mum?" I smiled, looked out the window, and said, "Legacy." She didn't ask again. The church hall was warm with morning light. Rows of chairs had been arranged, simple and straight. A table at the front held a small vase of flowers and a thick manila envelope. The revised will. Harold was already there, seated off to the side, a closed briefcase by his feet. Slowly, they filed in. My daughter, her husband, Danny, my niece, my cousin, even one of the neighbors, which surprised me. The air was quiet. No laughter, just waiting. I stood at the front and thanked them all for coming. I didn't speak long, just a few words about family, about memory, about how easy it is to forget the hands that held you before you could walk. Then I stepped aside, and Harold stood. He cleared his throat, opened the envelope, and began to read. The first page was standard. Identity. Legal confirmations. The room shifted slightly as he continued. My daughter sat forward, her husband's mouth flattened. Names were mentioned. Bequests. Assets. Then silence. Harold paused before the final line, the one I'd asked him to save until the end. And, to the individual listed by others as a house guest in my final years, I leave full title to the home located at, and he named the address. All heads turned. I didn't move. Harold folded the paper and placed it back in the envelope. Then he looked up and looked straight at me. No one spoke at first, not even a breath. Just the shuffle of paper as Harold tucked the will back into his briefcase and fastened the latch. My daughter blinked, slowly, as though trying to blink away a word she must have misheard. Her husband turned his eyes toward her, searching for a cue. Should they laugh? Should they object? Should they pretend it was a joke? But there was no punchline. Only me, standing at the front of the room, looking at them the same way they'd looked at me for months. Like I didn't quite belong. Danny, bless him, looked confused. He tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked, "Wait, Grandma owns the house?" My daughter didn't answer. She just sat there, hands frozen on her lap, knuckles white, the skin around her mouth twitching with something halfway between disbelief and panic. I had given her every opportunity to behave with grace. I had shared my home, my money, my time. I had swallowed every slight, every whisper, every plan made as though I were already gone. And now, finally, I had taken back the one thing that could not be ignored. The truth. The cousin was the first to move. She stood slowly and walked toward me, her heels clicking gently on the hardwood floor. She hugged me, tight, not performative, then whispered, "You did it right." I nodded. Her presence, as small as it might seem, reminded me that not everyone had forgotten, that there were still a few in the room who remembered who I'd been before I became an inconvenience. Harold spoke next. Calm, methodical. He outlined the validity of the document, the timeline in which it had been prepared, witnessed, and notarized. There could be no dispute. It wasn't spiteful. It wasn't secret. It was simply final. My daughter finally spoke then, but not to me. To Harold. She wasn't well. She was confused. There's no way she meant for this to happen. He looked at her with the weary patience of someone who's heard it all before. She was of sound mind, documented and recorded. I have video, if needed. Her mouth closed, her eyes sharp and wet. I didn't say much. I didn't have to. The room had already spoken for me. The silence was no longer mine to carry. It belonged to them now, to the people who had counted me out, spoken over me, made plans in rooms I was still standing in. My daughter's husband tried to say something about all we'd been through as a family, how stressful it had been, how unfair it felt. I raised a hand, not to silence him, but to stop myself from laughing. Fairness. What a curious word from a man who had once discussed selling my bedroom while I was still sleeping in it. I dismissed the gathering after that. There was nothing left to debate. Some filed out quickly. Others lingered, pretending to straighten chairs or check phones, but I watched them all leave, one by one, until it was just Harold and me, again, sitting in the quiet light. "Do you want a ride home?" he asked. I shook my head. "I think I'll walk a bit. Let the air settle." He nodded and placed a hand on my shoulder. Not pity, just presence. When I got back to the house, it felt different, not newer, not grander, just honest. Like I had finally stepped back into something that had always been mine. My daughter was already there, sitting on the front steps, arms crossed tight over her chest. She didn't look up as I passed. She didn't speak. I opened the door with my own key, the same one I'd always had, but which she once offered to replace with a simpler fob system. Inside, the house was quiet. I made tea, sat by the window, let the sunlight hit my face. Later that evening, she came into the kitchen. Her tone had changed. No anger now, just exhaustion. "You could have told me," she said. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the child I raised, but the woman shaped by convenience and control. I answered carefully. "I did. You just stopped listening." She tried to justify things, said she'd been worried about money, about the future, about how she'd sacrificed to take me in. I listened, because I owed her that much. But when she said she never meant to hurt me, I finally spoke from the place I'd been holding back. "You didn't have to mean it. You just had to do it, every day, quietly. Like I wasn't standing there watching it happen." She cried then, softly, not for show. I let her. Grief doesn't always belong to death. Sometimes it belongs to the loss of a version of yourself you can't go back to. We didn't argue after that. There was no point. She knew the will was airtight. The house was legally mine. But more than that, the power had shifted. She couldn't call me the house guest anymore. Not out loud, not even in her thoughts, because the house, and everything inside it, now carried my name like a stamp, not as revenge, but as recognition. In the weeks that followed, we made changes. Quiet ones. They moved into the smaller guest room. I kept the master, not out of spite, but because I needed a door that locked and a window that faced the sunrise. I hired someone to help with meals, not because I couldn't cook, but because I no longer wanted to do it out of obligation. My daughter resented the shift, but she adapted. People do, especially when the alternative is leaving with nothing. One day, while organizing paperwork, I found the old brochures for senior homes still tucked inside my desk. I smiled, folded them gently, and placed them in a stamped envelope addressed to myself. I wrote on the front, "Return to sender, still standing." Spring came early that year, the kind of spring where you can smell the soil waking up. I began walking in the mornings again, something I hadn't done since before I moved in with him. Just 1 block, maybe 2. Slowly, I wore my husband's old windbreaker, the navy one with the fraying cuff, and passed the same homes we'd once driven by when we first gave them the down payment. They all looked a little older, just like I did. But the light hit everything differently now, not softer, just clearer. Inside the house, things settled into a new rhythm, not warm, not cold, just balanced. My daughter kept her distance. Her husband became polite to the point of silence. And Danny began to ask real questions. Not about property, not about money. About me, where I grew up, what my father did, and why I never remarried. He was curious in a way that felt honest. I took him to the attic one afternoon and showed him the box of letters his grandfather had written me while stationed overseas. He read every one, quietly, like they were sacred. They never asked to reverse the will, not once. I think they knew better. My lawyer, Harold, had left no openings, no ambiguities. Everything had been done by the book, with witnesses, signatures, timestamps, even a video file stored safely in his firm's system. I had given them no room to argue, just a door to walk through, if they still wanted to be part of my life. Occasionally, I saw my daughter watching me, when she thought I wasn't looking, a strange expression on her face, not anger, not sorrow, Maybe something closer to recognition. The painful kind. The kind that says, I tried to erase you, and now I'm the one who feels ghosted. I didn't gloat. I didn't withdraw. I just kept being, making tea, reading books, paying the mortgage, now directly, in my name. And with every quiet act, I reclaimed what they tried to make temporary, my place. I updated a few things around the house. Nothing flashy, just small restorations. A new lock on the back door, curtains that let the morning light in. I had the fireplace cleaned and lit it for the first time in years. It felt good to see something glow. One night I sat there and let myself cry. Not out of sadness, but out of release. I had held so much in, for so long, trying not to offend, not to disrupt. But there's a cost to swallowing your own grief. Eventually, it fills you to the brim. Some neighbors started stopping by again. They'd always assumed I was just visiting, a guest, passing through. When they found out the house was mine, a few were surprised. A few weren't. One woman said, I always wondered why your name was never on the mailbox. I smiled, because I forgot I had one. Time passed. Danny grew taller. His voice began to change. One morning, he knocked on my door and handed me a short essay he'd written for school. The topic was, a time I misunderstood someone. It was about me, about the way he used to think I was just staying for a while, about the moment he realized the house wouldn't exist without me. I kept the paper, folded inside my Bible, right next to the original will, just for memory's sake. Eventually, I sat down and wrote a new letter. Not a will, a real letter. To Danny. I didn't tell anyone. I wrote it on real stationery, in blue ink with no corrections. I told him about the choices I made, the silence I kept, the way it feels when people you love start treating you like a burden. I told him I hoped he'd never know that feeling. But if he did, if it ever happened to him, I hoped he'd remember what I did. That quiet power isn't weakness. That dignity isn't given. It's reclaimed. I gave the letter to Harold and asked him to deliver it to Danny only when I was gone. Not as a revelation, just as a reminder. Because some truths don't need to arrive in a courtroom or a reading. Sometimes they arrive as memory. I still don't know if my daughter truly regrets what she did. She keeps her words careful now, checks in on my prescriptions, asks about my doctor's appointments, but I can feel the guilt living beneath her gestures. Not quite spoken, not quite gone. And maybe that's enough. Maybe living with the weight of her own choices is the quietest justice of all. One afternoon, I stood in the doorway of what used to be the guest room, the one I had slept in. I looked at the empty dresser, the lamp still missing its bulb, and I realized I didn't need to be angry anymore. I didn't need to haunt that room, because it no longer haunted me. I still cook sometimes, when I want to, not when I feel I have to. I still take slow walks. I still fold my own laundry. But I do it now in a home that holds my name, my story, my breath. Not borrowed, not tolerated. Mine. If you've ever watched someone shrink inside their own life, if you've ever been called a guest in your own story, let this be a reminder. It's never too late to reclaim what was quietly stolen. And if stories like this resonate with you, subscribe. Because silence should never be how someone's story ends.